Welcome. It's been a while since I've made a video. I've been busy with work, but also launching a new mindfulness for tinnitus class. We just had our first class. We got a good group of about 15 folks. The next one will be starting in early November. So I thought I would do a video on the most recent edition of Tinnitus Today. Tinnitus Today is the magazine of the American Tinnitus Association, published 3 times a year. If you don't know about the American Tinnitus Association, you should, and you should become a member at www.ata.org. A lot of good stuff in this issue, as is almost invariably the case. I am especially delighted by this issue because the focus of the first 3 articles is on one of my favorite therapeutic interventions, acceptance and commitment therapy. And I have a video actually on this channel about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I'll put a link to it in the notes just below. So, the acceptance and commitment therapy. Um, no easy way to describe it. The articles are 2 articles by Stephen Hayes and an interview with Stephen Hayes. Stephen Hayes is the creator of acceptance and commitment therapy, although it's kind of wrong, I think, to use that term because it is not necessarily derivative, but it does rely on some already established modalities. I always describe acceptance and commitment therapy in the following way. If John Kabat-Zinn and Viktor Frankl had a kid, it would be acceptance and commitment therapy. And when I do that, everybody has a blank stare on their face, so I will explain. There are really 2 parts to acceptance and commitment therapy. And I guess I'll just read a little bit from these articles because this is more or less what I was just saying. This is, again, from one of Stephen Hayes' articles in here. ACT combines self-kindness and mindfulness skills with value and commitment skills and is perhaps the most researched new method of psychological intervention over the last 20 years. That's pretty accurate. So mindfulness, which if you've been on this channel, you know about, is a good chunk of acceptance and commitment therapy, and values. What gives our life meaning? And this is where the Viktor Frankl is in his famous book Man's Search for Meaning, talks about the fact that life. Frankl was in the concentration camps in Germany. I'll take a brief detour here, and what he saw was some people survived and some people did not, who underwent the same physical conditionings and were more or less the same age and shape. And what he came to the conclusion was that those who believed their life had a meaning were much more likely to survive than those who were just, to use a term from the Big Lebowski, nihilists, who just didn't, had given up finding meaning and purpose. And this is what acceptance commitment does, is it throws a big chunk of value theory into therapy, and we're tasked to make our life meaningful. So there are these 2 distinct elements to acceptance and commitment therapy, which I really resonate with me very much so. So I am a big fan and a user of acceptance and commitment therapy. But what's interesting is that Stephen Hayes has tinnitus. He didn't develop it like many of us later in life, much later than he came up with this intervention. And he tells an interesting story in the article, which I didn't exactly know about. So, I did know the story of how he developed acceptance and commitment therapy. He had a rather famous panic attack. He was a faculty member at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, I believe it was. And he had a panic attack in a faculty meeting. Now, I've been in faculty meetings, and God knows I've wanted to have my share of panic attacks, but he went into a full-blown one. I think he was almost ready to give up academia, And he did develop this therapy. Um, and interestingly, he wound up using it some 20, 30 years later when he developed tinnitus. He developed tinnitus, as I say, in his late 50s, early 60s. And he tells a story in here that, when he developed it, he was just overwhelmed. And he never really put two and two together, never saw that his therapy might be of use in working with his tinnitus. He says, as I said in the first sentence of the story, I do not remember once thinking ringing in my ears is nothing like panic, but I suspect somewhere deep down that was my conviction. So he knew how to deal with panic, didn't think that he dealt with his panic via this therapy he invented, which again is used not only for panic, but anxiety, depression, trauma, a whole addiction. It's been applied and demonstrated and to be of use for a variety of interventions, and even two studies showing its use for tinnitus distress taken after he developed tinnitus. He helped with those studies. But he tells it, how can you explain it took me 3 years of suffering and the most distressing kind of thoughts a person can think before it even occurred to me, dude, perhaps you can apply your life's work to this issue. I find it kind of, funny. It took him 3 years to figure this out. But once he did, he says it's like he has this instant conversion. He tells us in the story. Um, I went for an hour-long walk in my neighborhood, exploring my tinnitus from an ACT perspective. And when I came back, it was 60 to 70% handled. Pretty amazing in one 1 hour-long walk. In a couple more days, it was 100% handled. Now, it's interesting because when I developed tinnitus, I pretty much started working with mindfulness and meditation relatively soon after that. I think even before I looked at the evidence, it just made sense to me that this practice is going to apply to this tinnitus. And I doubled down on my meditation as well. I started seeing a therapist. But so I didn't have the Stephen Hayes instant karma, as it were. But thank God it worked for him in that way. And as I said, since there's been a couple of studies. He's got some interesting phrases that I think it's worth reading. He talks about how he deals with tinnitus today and how he advises us to work with tinnitus. And he says, right now he has to look to see if it's there. And when he looks, it's there. I'm writing about tinnitus, he says, so I have to look there. And yes, right now my ears are screaming. So what? I don't care about that either, and you can't make me. Ringing or not ringing is equal. And that is, my friends, habituation. That's what we all aim for. And that's what I said, the mindfulness training. And this is essentially what he describes is working with the mindfulness component of tinnitus as a way of just having it be there, noticing it and not reacting. This is mindfulness. Now, he doesn't exactly talk about the value component. I think that's an interesting element. But that will have to wait for another day. He does give the 5 principles of ACT that he thinks are relevant to tinnitus: acceptance, learning to feel, just simply acknowledging the presence of experience without trying to avoid or suppress them. This is key to all of ACT. Applied to depression, anxiety, anything. Just allow what's there to be there. Don't try to get rid of it. Don't push it away. Don't be overwhelmed by it. Just notice it. Cognitive diffusion is what he calls, and that means just not being connected to the experience. Cognitive diffusion refers to the process of observing thoughts without getting entangled or fused with them. And again, we have these thoughts about tinnitus. We all do. But if we can just observe them and not be caught in them, right, that's the key. Sense of self. Tinnitus does not define who we are as individual. A healthy sense of detachment and perspective taking promotes resilience and offers great freedom of choice about how to behave in the presence of constant noise. Values, choosing what is important. A person with tinnitus may value connecting with others. They can choose to engage in activities that facilitate social interactions, such as joining support groups or participating in community events. Committed action, creating habits of value based actions. Finally, consider how to put your values into action. If you put your life on hold while fighting a war with the ringing, take your life back. What if there was a war and nobody came? What if you respectively declined the mind's invocation to care about the noise and instead put moments of chosen caring into your life in the form of behavior? As you do that, tinnitus interference may diminish in an almost point to point fashion. So the idea is that we're focused on what's important in our life, on the big value questions, and act as things like, family, uh, health, community, relationships, work, um, self improvement. Right? Focus on what's important to you, put your energy there. And if you focus on those values, the other stuff like tinnitus will fall into the background, or that is the idea. So that's, I think, probably enough about Stephen Hayes for this session. Again, that's the lead three articles. I think running through, just want to get through a couple more of these. There is a very interesting review of what are called the guidelines about tinnitus treatment. Uh, just looking at how different countries around the world, what guidelines they have for tinnitus. It's just a comparative study, and unsurprisingly, perhaps there's no agreement. They look at 6 guidelines from the U.S., Switzerland, Europe, Britain, Germany, and Japan to see what the countries recommend. And I think everyone includes cognitive behavior therapy as a recommendation. CBT is the best investigated of all the treatments that has been shown to be effective in reducing scores on tinnitus questionnaires, reducing symptoms of depression, and improving anxiety and health related quality of life. It does note, however, the strength of the evidence is low and the availability of tinnitus specific CBT is limited. Hey, tinnitus specific, anybody want tinnitus specific CBT, get a hold of me. But yeah, there's not a lot of us out there. And the evidence is less than overwhelming. I mean, that needs to be stated truly. Just because there hasn't been that many studies and they don't use really solid controls when they do CBT. Sometimes they have a group that doesn't get any treatment, but not a lot of the CBT studies or the mindfulness studies for that matter use a group getting some other form of therapy. But if we look at, where is this very interesting part about the comparing the guidelines, I just want to run through that. So with Britain, propose a stepwise approach: online CBT, group-based counseling, CBT acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness, individual CBT. So go those 3 routes, I guess. The German guideline is the only guideline that recommends auditory training and recommends against sound therapy, which is interesting. If any of you have read the book Living Well with Tinnitus, that is a recent book that is also very much opposed to using sound. The U.S. guideline is unique in considering sound therapy a treatment option. Again, the only guideline that does line. The guideline is in need of an update. The Swiss guideline is very brief and not backed by medical society or tinnitus experts. The European guideline was developed by researchers and clinicians from different countries in Europe. It's noted that there's no summary of evidence that forms the basis of the guideline, and the Japanese guideline was a formal effort that graded recommendations as strong recommendation and no recommendation. So not a lot there, except to know that there is no consensus in how to work with tinnitus, perhaps not surprising. Across country, a review of James Henry's book, the Tinnitus book. I also reviewed that on this channel, and I will put a link to that. I'll read a little bit from the article. It's likely that more than 1 billion people experience, wow, an interesting and hundreds of millions suffer from, to varying degrees, the perceptions of tinnitus sound. I haven't heard that 1 billion number. It sounds pretty intense when you put it that way. At the same time, the tinnitus sensation is as obvious to its owner as it is invisible, unbearable, and incomprehensible to other people. Tinnitus sound may be unobtrusive and ignorable, intermittently challenging, all-consuming, or anything in between. Consider that tinnitus and emotional distress are often mutually reinforcing, while many patients indicate that hearing loud sounds makes their tinnitus louder. Taken together, tinnitus's high prevalence and heterogeneous presentation confound efforts at curing the condition with standard medical interventions. Against this backdrop, and in an environment in which many patients may struggle to find accurate information conveyed in a reasonable and verifiable manner, Dr. James Henry's The Tinnitus Book, Dr. James Henry offers a tinnitus book. His life, research, and career have focused upon the delivery and improvement of clinical services and related counseling information intended to support patient coping and quality of life. The tinnitus book. In the tinnitus book, Dr. Henry provides a considerable amount of relevant and relatable information for patients, as well as for the students and practitioners who serve them. Boiled down, this is a book that will foster self-care for patients with bothersome tinnitus, and by extension, the confidence of those individuals charged with their care. It's a wonderful book, as you'll know if you've seen my review. As I said, everything you need to know about tinnitus, not necessarily everything you want to know about tinnitus, is in that book, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It's good also to see to pick up the book. I might want to read the review first, as I said. So another article, a wonderful article by Dr. Bruce Hubbard, talking about assessing and treating tinnitus-related anxiety and insomnia. And again, he goes over the evidence here. I'll just read a little bit to give you a sense of a flavor of the article. Anxiety and insomnia are among the most common health problems in the United States. Over the course of our lifetime, 1 in 5 of us will suffer an anxiety disorder, and 1 in 3 a spell of insomnia. Although genetics play a role, the primary trigger for anxiety and insomnia is stress. There is no question tinnitus can be sufficiently stressful to trigger anxiety and insomnia. Indeed, many people describe the onset of tinnitus as traumatic. I couldn't agree more. I think there's a lot of work on tinnitus and trauma that still needs to be done. Not surprisingly, studies find that close to 50% of people with tinnitus distress meet the diagnostic criteria for anxiety, and up to 80% complain of insomnia. And Dr. Hubbard goes on, in my experience, untreated anxiety and insomnia are the greatest cause for concern with tinnitus. These conditions make it harder to cope with tinnitus and can block habituation and recovery. It is critical then that you or your loved one know how to respond to these problems if they occur. In this article, I provide tips for addressing tinnitus-related anxiety and accessing the right help. So he goes over, basically some of the medication recommendations, some of the information about tinnitus-related insomnia. The treatment is known as CBTI, or cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia. If you're interested, you can look up some information online about that. He talks about a fundamental rule of insomnia treatment is to first address any health-related concerns. In any case, the source is clear: anxious, hypervigilant attention to tinnitus. Addressing your reaction to tinnitus then is the first step to better sleep. And he talks about mindfulness as a way to work with this element. Working on, primary care physicians are the place to go to work with medication. And just it gives 3 sorts of classifications for anxiety and 3 classifications for sleep disturbance: mild, moderate, and severe. What each of those looks like, just to kind of give you an idea. So, for example, if you have recurrent feelings of unease and worry, attention to tinnitus during periods of quiet and low activity, and mildly impaired sleep. That's mild anxiety. And there you just simply use self-help materials, relaxation tape, maybe some CBT, perhaps some medication, short-term medication. Moderate anxiety would be persistent feeling of unease, frequent fear of the worst, tinnitus, hypervigilance more than 50% of the time, moderately impaired sleep. Then you want to definitely do some CBT, maybe acceptance and commitment therapy, again, anxiety meds, perhaps consider SSRIs, antidepressants, again, talking to your doctor. And there is where the first mention of short-acting sleep medication may come in. A severe feeling of impending doom, persistent fear of the worst, hypervigilance, panic attacks, severely impaired sleep, and persistent restlessness, then it really is time to get to a medical professional, and certainly a primary care physician, and perhaps even a psychiatrist, to expand the scope of sleep medication, again, antidepressants, and maybe anti-anxiety pills alongside of medication, alongside of therapy. So, again, a good overview of both anxiety and insomnia. The last couple articles are concerned, on a more positive note, are concerned with awe, AWE. And the first one is an interview with Dacher Keltner, who I've followed for a long time. He's a professor at University of California, Berkeley, host of a wonderful podcast, which I often refer to in my newsletter, called The Science of Happiness, in which he goes over evidence-based interventions to essentially in the spirit of positive psychology. Positive psychology is a discipline devoted to finding evidence-based interventions that have been shown to increase our psychological well-being. The idea being that just how we know to increase our physical health by doing things like exercising, various types of exercise, we actually do know what increases mental health, mental well-being. One of the more famous interventions is known as just keeping a gratitude journal. Actually, has been very much studied as improving our well-being. And what Dr. Keltner has been working on recently is the experience of awe, just feeling awe as being something that can just increase your sense of overall well-being. And if that increases, your sense of the stress decreases in proportion to you are kind of opening up to the universe. He has a best-selling book that just came out this year called Awe, The New Science of Everyday Wonder and How It Can Transform Your Life. Wonderful interview with Dr. Keltner. Talks about talks about his book, and let me just hit to the tinnitus part. The interviewer asked, "How do you find awe when you're unable to find comfort in your life because you're struggling with tinnitus?" First of all, let me extend my concern, compassion, and recognition on hard tinnitus can be. My thoughts are with all of you. One of the things that gives me hope is that awe has been found to have benefits for people suffering from really hard physical and mental conditions. For example, in one of our studies, we found a day of awe produced by rafting on a river led to a 30% drop in PTSD symptoms for a week among veterans. This is hopeful. I wrote the book Awe when suffering profoundly the loss of my younger brother, and I find personally as I write that brief experiences of awe help with grief. So yes, I think the cultivation of awe in ways I've pointed can help with the harder conditions of life. And it's a great podcast to check out, The Science of Happiness. It's a wonderful book, Awe. And I think I'll close on that. Gives you a nice overview of tinnitus today. And there's a lot more in there. That's just some of the highlights. So if you join, you will get a copy of the magazine. If you have any questions, get a hold of me. Otherwise, good luck. Take care of yourselves.